This simple apple crisp recipe is going to be the best. It's going to have a sweet and tart fruit filling along with a crisp and crumbly topping made with oats. So this dessert is going to have a great combination of not only flavors but also textures. I'm going to use golden delicious apples. I am using 1 pound or 454 grams or 16 ounces of prepped apples. I bought about 2 pounds worth of golden delicious. I skinned them, or I peeled them, I cut them, drizzled them with lemon juice, and then I froze them. And then when I was ready to make my simple apple crisp, I just took the frozen apples out of the freezer and defrosted them. You could use Granny Smith if you want. That's another tart apple. But personally, I would not use a super sweet fresh eating apple like Fuji or Honeycrisp. I think there's just so much sugar in the topping that it would be too sweet. Like I said, here are my apples. They're already prepped. And in order to make the fruit filling, I am going to add 1/3 cup of dark brown sugar as I measure it 80 grams, and 1/3 cup of white sugar as I measure it 70 grams. Normally in my recipes, I like to use light brown sugar, but I've made this with dark brown sugar before and it was really good. So I'm going to use dark brown sugar. I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of lemon juice just to help add to the acidity, 1/8 of a teaspoon of salt, 2 tablespoons of cornstarch to help bind everything together. And I'm also going to add 1/4 teaspoon of ground cinnamon. Although most crisp recipes usually involve a lot of spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, maybe some others, in relatively large quantities, in my opinion, most fruit desserts are best when you just add a little bit of spice, just enough to add something to the background, but not enough to compete with the star of the show. What differentiates a crisp from other fruit-based desserts is the crumble topping. And the star of the crumble topping is butter. Here I have 1 stick or 113 grams of butter. It's nice and cold. What I need to do is I need to get this butter into smaller pieces. So you probably could grate it on a cheese grater if you want to. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut it into smaller pieces. So I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to cut it into pieces like this. Should probably get a better knife, but well. And these butter squares, for lack of a better way of describing them, I am going to cut them into smaller pieces like this. I'm going to do that with my stick of butter. Just cut them like this. Cut the butter into small pieces. This is very difficult, if not impossible, if your butter is warm. So you want your butter to be nice and cold. I just finished cutting the butter into little cubes. Now it's time to move on to the next step of making the crumble topping for my apple crisp. To make the topping, like I said, you will need sugar, flour, oats, and pecans. And what's easy about the topping is that all you have to remember is 1/2 cup. Here I have dark brown sugar. You can use light. You could even use white sugar if you want. I have 1/2 cup of brown sugar as I measure it 120 grams. 1/2 cup of old-fashioned oats, 40 grams. In the previous crisp recipes that I did, I'm pretty sure I used quick cooking oats, but today I'm going to use old-fashioned rolled oats because I want a little more texture. I want to see how it's going to turn out. 1/2 cup of all-purpose flour, or as I measure 75 grams, along with 1/2 cup of chopped pecans, or 60 grams. What I'm going to do now is I am going to mash everything together. I think this is easier to do in stages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brown sugar, some of my brown sugar, and I'm going to sprinkle it over some of the butter here. I'm going to take some of my oats, some of my flour, and some of my pecans. Actually, this is probably easier to do without the pecans. I'll add those later. And I am just going to press down with my fork like this. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get little pieces of flour that are completely covered by the flour, sugar, and oat mixture. I have also seen people use their fingers like this. So they will take some of the sugar here like that, some of the oats, the flour, and it's probably better to mix the dry ingredients first, and then they will just take the butter in their hands and go like this, just crumbling it like that, because like I said, your goal is to have little pieces of butter that are covered or coated in the sugar, flour, and oat mixture. Honestly, I think that using your hands is probably easier than using a fork. If you have a pastry cutter, you can use a pastry cutter too. But honestly, I think this is pretty easy to do just with your hands. So I am going to do that. I'm going to finish making my crumble topping. And I keep saying it's probably better to mix the dry ingredients first, but I did not do that yet again. There we go. Like this, I'm just massaging the butter between my fingers. If you want to use melted butter, you could put everything into a bowl, pour in melted butter, but then you have to wait for the butter to solidify again, because once it re-solidifies, you will be able to crumble it between your fingers. I just finished making the crumble topping for my simple apple crisp. As you can see, the butter is now in little beads or little peas, and all of the dry ingredients are nicely combined. I think this was definitely easier to do without the nuts. So now that I'm pretty much done, I'm going to massage in the nuts. I just finished smoothing out the apple filling. Now I'm going to put on the crumble topping. I know this filling looks kind of wet, and actually the apples have probably released more liquid because they were frozen and then thawed than if you were to use fresh apples and you just slice them and put them into the crisp right away. But do not worry, you will still have a crispy top. Notice how I am just crumbling it on top nice and lightly like this. Another important thing to remember when making this simple apple crisp recipe is to not press down on the crumble topping. Although you might be tempted to press down on the crumble topping with oats and pecans, doing so will mix together the topping and the fruit filling, and the crumble will never crisp up in the oven. So like I said, literally just sprinkle the crumble topping on top of the fruit filling. If you realize that you accidentally added a bit more to one area than another, you can pick up little pieces of oats or pecans and move them around. That's fine, just don't press down and don't mix. When you are ready, put your apple crisp into a 350-degree oven for 60 minutes. I just pulled my simple apple crisp out of the oven. It was in at 350 uncovered for a full 60 minutes. This simple apple crisp recipe was the best because it was delicious and easy to make. All throughout this dish, there was the perfect combination of flavors. It was sweet, but not too sweet because I used a relatively tart apple. The dark brown sugar, the bit of cinnamon, and the bit of lemon juice added enough of extra flavor to make it interesting without competing with the star of the show, the apples. The crumble topping was delicious as well. The dark brown sugar and the butter adding a ton of flavor, and the oats and the pecans a ton of texture. In all honesty, one of the best things of a crisp in comparison to a pie or a cobbler is the combination of textures, especially the emphasis on crispiness. As you can see from the up-close photos, the old-fashioned oats and the pecans definitely added a nice crispiness to the crumble topping. However, I did want to point out that although I used old-fashioned rolled oats in this crisp and quick cooking oats in the other crisps that I made earlier this year, I honestly didn't notice a difference. Maybe it was that too much time had passed, but honestly, I couldn't tell a difference in terms of texture. So whether you have old-fashioned oats or quick cooking oats on hand, I think you could use either without significantly altering this recipe. As I said in my previous crisp recipe videos this year, I think it's important to use a tart fruit when making a crisp. There's already a good amount of sugar in the crumble topping, so if you use a sweet apple like Fuji or Honeycrisp, I don't think that this would be the same. Other than that one thing to keep in mind, I think that this simple apple crisp recipe is the best because it's so easy to make. Although the crumble topping may seem a bit intimidating, as long as you start with cold butter and you take your time, you'll be fine. And in all honesty, I've heard of people using melted butter in this, and even if you don't let it solidify, I'm sure if you just put it on top of the apples, it would probably be okay. So, if you're looking for a great apple recipe this fall, be sure to give this one a try. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.